Western Australia, to a lot of Australians, is a land of mystery, with, I suspect, a majority of non-Western Australians never venturing out to towns like Perth, Kalgoorlie or Geraldton. Thus, they also have very little idea about the politics of this far-flung region of the country. However, this region has been pushed into the forefront of Australian politics through 3 landslide state victories and a federal swing which helped our current Prime Minister get elected. So let me welcome you to this episode of Red State Blue State as we ask ourselves the question, is Western Australia no longer a Liberal stronghold? Now, just a reminder before we begin that this video was brought to you by my lovely patrons like Cameron Strauss, Tom Smarty, Edward Pierre, Darathinian, Sloan, Cody Jones and Loom High. For as little as $3 a month, you can get your name shouted out at the start of every Stormon videos, as well as access to bonus behind the scenes content, link in the description below. It might surprise you to know that Western Australia only got its first elected government in 1890, a solid couple of decades later than all other states in the Commonwealth. This was in part due to the lack of a population in the colony. However, eventually the colony would gain self-governance under premiership of John Forrest, who always seems to pop out in the history of everything in WA. Like, seriously, you could be thinking about some random tiny town in the desert and Forrest will randomly show up somewhere in the history book there. Anyway, while Forrest would govern WA through its first decade of governance, he would eventually resign to run for federal office in 1901, and what would follow would be a somewhat chaotic parliament as Forrest's allies and opponents would tussle alongside the new Labour Party, with none of the 3 factions able to win majority in any of the elections. Eventually, the Forrest allies would win out in a majority in the 1905 election. However, poor leadership would see Labour assume power in 1911. However, like what we've seen in other state governments, Labour wouldn't survive the First World War, and following the loss of confidence in 1916, the pro-Forrest members would assume control, now reformed as the Nationalist Party, like their federal counterparts. The Nationalists would govern for 8 years until losing to Labour in 1924, who had governed for 6 years until losing in 1930 following the Great Depression, only to win government back off the Nationals in 1933, governing for most of the 1930s and 40s. Now you're probably wondering why I'm only talking about the parties and not premiers, and that's due to both Labour and the Nationals frequently replacing their leaders while in office, making it very hard to identify key figures who would make a big impact on WA history. However, this continuous change of leaders would come to an end in 1947, as for the next 27 years we would have a series of single-led parties in charge, first with Ross McGlarty's Liberals, then Bert Hawke's Labour, then David Brand's Liberals, and then John Tonkin's Labour. As you might notice, WA is a very swingy state, electing both parties fairly evenly. WA has never really seen a one-party dominate for more than 4 election cycles, with most parties only winning 2 to 3 elections at a time. This would continue through the 70s, with both the Liberal and Labour experiencing 3 terms in power, with Labour this time being notable for electing Carmen Lawrence as their leader in 1990, making her the first female head of government in Australian history. However, she wouldn't be so lucky as to win the 1993 election, with WA voting the Liberals back into power for another 2 terms. This would continue WA's tradition of temporary governments, with Labour coming back into power for 2 terms in 2001, followed by the Liberals in 2008, and then Labour again in 2017, but we'll be talking about that Labour government in a later section. Now, what might surprise you is the fact that, while WA voters were flip-flopping on which party should represent them on the state level, they were pretty frequently choosing Liberals over Labour parties to represent them on the federal level. Since 1943, when Labour won every seat in the state, the Liberals have won the majority of WA's seats 20 times out of the 29 subsequent elections. In fact, Labour winning the majority of WA seats in the 2022 election was the first time in almost 30 years that the party has held a majority of WA's federal seats. However, with Labour increasing its majority in the West with 2 new seats in 2025, it possibly looks like the state's favourable views to the federal Liberals might not be so solid anymore. In general, WA has been a state defined by its rich mineral wealth and its giant mining companies which extract said wealth. It also should be noted that despite being mostly an arid state, WA also has a large rural region which wields notable political power. Thus, it's not too surprising that these bodies combine to support the Liberals and Nationals parties over the Labour Party. WA is also a state with a long history of succession. In a lot of ways, WA was never meant to join Australia and did so reluctantly. While this succession streak hasn't seen WA seriously push for independence, with the exception of a brief moment in the 1930s, it has seen the state demand a lot of autonomy from Canberra, and it's predominantly been the Liberals and Nationals on the federal level accommodating those requests. In 2018, we saw the then Morrison government sign an extremely favourable GST reform, which saw WA receive a much greater share of the tax revenue, which has since seen the state deliver multiple budget surpluses at the expense of other states' budget deficits. However, we obviously have to talk about the recent events impacting the state and how they have potentially permanently altered WA's future. As I mentioned in the history section, in 2017, Labor under Mark McGowan was swung into power off the back of a giant landslide. In fact, the 2017 landslide was the largest majority of seats as a percentage that a Labor Party has ever received in WA history. McGowan will pull off this amazing feat after a very successful listening tour of WA, in which he identified the key issues that WA voters had and sought to make them the focus of his campaign. Being well aware of the issues WA voters had, McGowan was easy to remain highly popular through 2018 and 2019, with polling showing Labor around 54% of the two-party preferred. However, it was 2020 which was then Labor's polling up into the stratosphere. Obviously, 2020 was the year in which the world went down the drain as the COVID-19 pandemic took over the planet. McGowan, like a lot of other state premiers, would seek to shut down WA's borders to prevent COVID outbreaks in other states reaching WA. This would lead billionaire Clive Palmer to sue the WA government, with his suing motion initially getting support of the federal Liberal government under Scott Morrison. While the federal Liberals would back away their support of the challenge when it became apparent that it was not politically popular, the damage would already be done, and the WA Liberals would be wiped out in the 2021 election, winning only 2 seats out of 59 and losing opposition status to the Nationals. The next year, the Liberals would again be wiped out on the federal level when they lost 5 seats, with 4 being picked up by Labor. In fact, this strong showing by Labor in WA is in fact what prevented Labor having to deal with a minority government in 2022. While some might have assumed Labor's strong results to be a fluke built off the unique circumstances from COVID and the then Morrison Liberal government's poor decision, the results in 2025, in which Labor, now under Premier Roger Cook, retained its giant majority with minimal losses, while expanding their seat count in the federal election, shows that WA is very much a pro-Labor state, at least at the moment. In general, Labor has been playing a very successful game in Parliament, putting popular left-wing policies like environmentalism aside in order to broaden their appeal to the mining and resource sectors. While this has annoyed many of the party's left faction, along with the Greens and other progressive voters, it has shown no sign of hurting the party politically, and they look to be on track for a 4th win come 2029. Unfortunately though, unlike Victoria, where we've had 40 years to observe this leftward shift, WA has only really been showing signs of being a solid red state since 2017, thus we cannot really say if it's here to stay. We're already seeing the breakdown in the relationship between the state and federal Labor branches when it comes to the live export ban of sheep and tougher environmental regulations. Whether these policies could drive WA back into a Liberal government, we'll just have to wait and see. But as it currently stands, WA is in territory that it's never really seen since it became a self-governed territory in 1890. Well, I hope you enjoyed that somewhat overdue deep dive into our nation's largest state. Next time we turn to a state I know quite well due to it being my own home state. Join me next time as I ask the question, how did Labor come to dominate South Australia?